Okay, this video is more on factoring and reviewing. As we're going to go through here, I can't split my screen, but I'm going to keep referring to this chart. The first thing we're going to look for is the greatest common factor. After we deal with that, we'll decide if it's a binomial or trinomial. If it's a binomial, we'll decide if it's square or cubes. And if it's trinomial, we'll decide if the leading coefficient's 1 or not 1. And based on that information, that is how we will know what to do. Okay, so let's try the first one. On number one, first thing we need to look for is the greatest common factor. There is not one, so now we see that it's a binomial. So now we have to decide if it's squares or cubes. If it's squares, all the exponents are going to be divisible by 2. If it's cubes, all the exponents are going to be divisible by 3. Well, on the first one, it's going to be squares because 8 is only divisible by 2. 6 can go either way, but 8's only 2, so we have to work with 2's. When it's squares, we're going to go straight to our 2 parentheses. The square root of 36x squared is 6x cubed. Because remember, when it's squared, we divide the when we take the square root, we divide the exponent by 2. And 6x cubed, one's going to be a plus, one's a minus. And the square root of 49y to the 8th would be 7y to the 4th. Okay, let's try this again on number 2. On number 2, the first thing we look for is the greatest common factor. There isn't one. Then we see that it is a binomial. Now we have to decide if it's squares or cubes. Squares, all the exponents are divisible by 2. Cubes, all the exponents are divisible by 3. On this one, the only one that works would be cubes. So the cube pattern, it's not like squares where they're almost matching parentheses. The first parentheses, we take the cube root, and the second parentheses, we use the pattern. We square, multiply together, square. Okay, so let's try that. The cube root of 27x cubed would be 3, and then we divide the exponent by 3, so x. First sign matches. The cube root of 8 is 2. The cube root of y to the 12th, well, 12 divided by 3 is 4. That's the first parentheses. The second parentheses, you got to square 3x, and we get 9x squared. Change the sign, multiply the two things together. So I get 6x y to the 4th. The last sign is always plus, and then I square 2y to the 4th. 2 squared is 4, and y to the 4th squared. I'm multiplying the exponent by 2, so I get y to the 8th. Okay, let's try number 3. First thing we look for is the greatest common factor. We don't have one, then we got to decide if it's a binomial or a trinomial. This one is a trinomial. The leading coefficient is 1, so we can go straight to our 2 parentheses. Now, normally I'd write x and an x, but that multiplies back to x squared. We need to multiply back to x to the 4th. So remember, we're going to do x squared and x squared because it's always going to match this middle term here. Now we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to negative 18 and add to negative 7. Well, that would be negative 9 and positive 2. But we got to check. If the exponents are something other than the invisible 1, which they are, then we have to see if it factors further. This first one, it's a binomial. I can take the square root of everything. That will factor further. So this is going to factor to x plus 3, x minus 3. I can't do that with the second one because it doesn't factor any further because I cannot take the square root of 2. And so therefore, this one is going to stay x squared plus 2. So this whole thing is my final answer. I need to include everything. Okay, let's try this again on number 4. On number 4, the first thing we look for is the greatest common factor. There isn't one. So now we have to decide if it's a binomial or a trinomial. It's a trinomial. Then we have to decide if the leading coefficient is 1 or not 1. It's 1. So when it's 1, we're going to go straight to our 2 parentheses. We need 2 numbers, or normally we have an x and an x. That multiplies to x squared, but we need to go to x to the 6th. So we're going to do x cubed and x cubed because remember, it's going to match that middle term. Now we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to negative 24 and add to positive 5. Well, those 2 numbers would be positive 8 and negative 3. But now, because the exponent is something other than the invisible positive 1, we need to see if this would factor further. Well, the first one, it's a binomial. this is with a 3, I'm thinking cube roots, and 8 is on my list of cube roots, so it's going to be the cube root pattern. So the cube root of x cubed is x, the cube root of 8 is 2. My next parentheses is not x minus 2. That's the pattern when it's squares, but for cubes, I have to square, multiply together, square. So I square x and I get x squared, change the sign, multiply the two things together. The last sign is always positive, and then I square the 2 and get the 4. Now, this one, x cubed works for a cube pattern, but I can't take the cube root of 3, so I can't factor it anymore. So then that becomes my final answer. All right, let's look at number 5. The first thing we look for is the greatest common factor. Because this leading coefficient is negative, that means there has to be a greatest common factor. We have to take out a minimum -1, but this one we can actually take out a -3. And when I do that, I get positive x squared, and 12 divided by -3 is -4. Now looking just inside the parentheses, I've got a binomial, and I can decide if it's squares or cubes, and this one would be squares. So now I'm going to rewrite this as x plus 2, x minus 2. Okay, number 6. First thing we look for is the greatest common factor. But because that leading coefficient is negative, we know at a minimum we have to take out a -1, but we can actually take out a -6 here. And that's going to leave us with x cubed plus 1. Now looking just inside the parentheses, do we have a binomial or a trinomial? Well, it's a binomial, so we have to decide if it's squares or cubes. Well, this one's pretty obvious. It's going to be cubes, and we can take the cube root of 1, so that's our pattern. The GCF gets a free ride. The cube root of x cubed is x. Cube root of 1 is 1. My next parentheses is not x minus 1. That's the squares pattern. I'm doing cubes. I have to square, multiply together, square. So squaring x gives me x squared. Change the sign, multiply the two things together. The last sign is positive, and I square 1 and get 1. Okay, 2 more. Number 7. First thing we look for is the greatest common factor. We do not have one. So we need to decide if it's a binomial or a trinomial. Well, this one is a trinomial. So when it's a trinomial, we have to decide if the leading coefficient is 1 or not 1. This one is 6. That means it's not 1. So we have to split the middle term. And the first thing we do to split the middle term is take 6 times -35, which is going to give us -210. Okay, now I need two numbers that multiply to -210 and add to +1. That means they can only be one digit apart. Well, I know 21 and 10 would work, but they can multiply to -210, but that's not going to work because they're not one apart, so that's not an option. So now I'm going to try 210, I don't know, divided by 15. Oh, there we go. I get 15 and 14. Okay, but it's got to be a positive one, so the 15 has to be positive and 14 has to be negative. Okay, let's rewrite it. So I'm going to have 6x squared plus 15x minus 14x minus 35. Now I'm going to factor it by grouping. Out of the first two terms, I can take a 3x out, and I'm left with 2x. 15 divided by 3 is 5. Whatever sign is in the middle, I'm going to copy it straight down. Out of the next two terms, I can take out a 7, but it's really a -7. So -14x divided by -7 is +2x. -35 divided by -7 is +5. So now when I rewrite this, I'm going to have 2x plus 5 times 3x minus 7. Okay, one last one. Number 8. First thing we look for is the greatest common factor. We do not have one. So we have to decide if it's a binomial or a trinomial. Well, it's a trinomial. With a trinomial, we have to decide if the leading coefficient is 1 or not 1. In this case, it's not 1. That means we're going to split the middle term. So the first thing we need to do is take 12 times -2. That gives me -24. So now I need two numbers that multiply to -24 and add to -5. Let's say we have no idea. Okay, well, because it adds to a negative, then the bigger number has to be negative. So we could have 2 and -12. That doesn't work because that adds to -10. We could have 3 and -8. Oh, that works. So this is my option. Okay, so now I'm going to rewrite it. So I have 12x to the 6 plus 3x. Remember, it's got to match this middle one here. So I'm going to have 3x to the third minus 8x to the, whoops, at the third. But again, these all match, minus 2. Now I'm going to factor by grouping. Out of the first two, I can take out a 3x cubed, and that leaves me with 4x cubed plus 1. Yes, you have to write the 1 there. The minus in the middle gets carried straight down. At the next two, I can take in a 2, and that leaves me with 4x cubed plus 1. So now I can rewrite it. So I have 4x cubed plus 1 times 3x cubed minus 2. Now I need to check. Do I even factor further? Well, the cubes, I'm looking at cube roots, but I can't take the cube root of 4, 1, 3. Well, or 1's okay, but I can't take the cube root of 4, 3, or 2. So nothing factors further. So that's my final answer.